My conversation today is with Rudolf Berger. Rudolf hosts one of the most unanimously acclaimed podcasts in the genres of esotericism, occultism, and the Western esoteric traditions, the Thoth-Hermes Podcast. Aside from being affable, eloquent, and extremely knowledgeable, Rudolf is a serious practitioner who has conferred with some of the brightest minds and is himself an essential part of the living Western esoteric traditions in the modern day. It was an honor and a pleasure to sit down with Rudolf, who has been one of the biggest inspirations to this podcast, and discuss the state of contemporary occultism, our shared love of conversation, magic, masonry, music, and more. I'm Ike Baker, and this is the Arcanum Podcast. First, I want to say you're currently in the midst of releasing season 10, right, of the Thoth-Hermes Podcast?
That's true, absolutely.
So congratulations, because I know, what a labor of this can be. Congratulations.
Well, certainly, congratulations to what you do, because it's quite amazing. And you do also, I guess, with the video, it's even more work than with audio only, isn't it?
It can be. It certainly can be. But I mean, obviously, I'm not gonna completely fanboy, but your podcast was a huge influence, but not only an influence, but a resource to a young esotericist and occultist just getting involved a couple of years ago in really initiatic orders. Been doing this for a long time, but I joined really firmly the Western esoteric initiatic orders around 2016. Mm-hmm. And so your podcast was a forum of, it wasn't just people waxing philosophical, is it people were established and practitioners where I felt I could gain reliable insight. So it's just been tremendous. And, you're continuing it. I know a little while back you announced that you were going to put it in abeyance for a little while. Is that correct?
That's true. I even thought I would stop it altogether, but then energy came back probably, and I said, well, maybe I should try to carry on.
Is that what happened? So you kind of figured that you had a little bit more time and energy for that stuff. Was that why you decided to reconsider, or was there a critical moment?
Not necessarily the time, but sometimes I'm professionally, I always worked artistically, right? And I kind of also have a feeling that my creative cycle is about 6 years-ish. And as it happened, I didn't do it on purpose, but I felt like, last December, I had quite a good run of shows before I stopped, where really everything came together, and it kind of topped with Walter Hanegraaff being my last guest before that break. And of course, that was quite a high point. And then I thought, well, it's Christmas, now let me take a break. And then the break became longer and longer. And finally I thought, well, maybe that was it, because the 6 years have passed. And I even announced that, I think it was April or May, I said, okay, look, guys, I think that was it. And well, then I considered doing something a bit differently. I wanted to go into feature-like podcasting or something like that. But in the end, when I thought about it, I thought, no, there's so much to be said. And also, I think how the world is going, how the world is developing nowadays, this might now sound grand, but of course we can only all do what we have to do in our corner and what we have to do in there. And I felt, well, if I say responsibility, I don't hope people take me too important or too heavy, but I think we got some responsibility of claiming what we believe in. And yeah, that was part of the decision. The energy came back and both together. Maybe I found a new voice again. So let's put it that way.
That's excellent. I definitely understand what you're talking about a little bit with feeling a responsibility. Yeah, absolutely. Especially as you're saying, kind of the way things are turning. And but I think that's one of the amazing things about just the the podcast community in general in Western esotericism, the occult scenes. Your podcast, Greg Kaminsky's Occult of Personality. That's a staple of the community for
who was my first contact with that, and also I even co-hosted a few shows with him. I don't know if you know that. Yeah.
Right. I think I had heard something about you apprenticing or something.
Exactly, something like that.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, that's wonderful. Who better to learn from? But
absolutely.
So obviously anybody that's listening to this is going to be well familiar with you, but on the odd chance that that's not the case, could you maybe talk a little bit about how you got started in the Western traditions and the occult?
With pleasure, yes. I mean, I'm now 63, so it's quite a few years back. I'm not one of those who started, at least not consciously, at age 5, feeling different from other kids or feeling being a weird kid, as one of our colleagues often says. But I realized that I wanted to go into that and search into that world maybe when I was 22, 23, so odd 40 years ago. And actually there were two currents that first took my interest. One, and probably the first, being anthroposophy. Well, I would rather say Rudolf Steiner himself and his work. Funny enough, it's exactly the week we are recording this that I finally issued my first episode on anthroposophy. So I never was member of the Anthroposophic Society, but I really liked what Steiner wrote, especially the early books, the ones that he wrote himself and were not recorded teachings of him, but really his proper work. And that opened quite a new world for me. And then a bit later on, maybe 4 or 5 years later, I started doing some shamanic work, more the Michael Harner type of shamanism. So not going too much out into nature, but more the things like shamanic dreaming and shamanic voyaging that you do at home and with sound. And that brings me maybe then back to what I think really happened, because, well, after those two things that brought me closer to what esotericism could be, then at a very early stage, Hermeticism came in, Freemasonry came in. Of course, I have been a Freemason for 32 years soon. So all of that led further and further, and the further I went, the more I got interested. And I've always been an eclecticist in the field. I try to find the things that work best for me, and that are not always only the traditional combinations of schools, but ceremonial magic, Hermeticism. I think that's where I feel most at home. But I might have to add something, because I said something about the early beginnings, and it is only at the very late stage, maybe the last 5 to 10 years, that I realized that my capacity of working in my professional field, which I started really very early, age 15, 16, I was already working professionally in the field of theater and opera. And at age 5, I did my first play on stage as a little angel in a nativity play. So this was something that came very early to me. And I think now, with hindsight, music, sound, and all that is related to it, and its effect on people, and how I approach the theater world and stage and everything, had a lot to do with my spiritual approach, but I wasn't aware of it then. I don't know if that's understandable what I'm saying, but I very strongly feel, when I see how I worked it back at the time, how I was able to produce my talent, I think there was a lot of instinct and a lot of spiritual guiding in that.
Yeah, I mean, that makes perfect sense to me. I also have a musical background.
As many of us do, actually, don't
for
we?
me, yeah, it's pretty interesting. I think that, believe it or not, it was what the processes inside myself, the changes in perception that I was experiencing, deeper levels that sort of attuned me, turned my gaze towards the possibility of magic and the occult and ritual. Little by little, I started noticing the more I delved into a project, there was this interior world that became more and more real. And then as I would go back into, my mundane life, I would kind of miss that. I would feel I'm out of place here.
So yeah, I see what you mean.
I think that makes perfect sense, actually.
It's also, when I went into rehearsal, for example, at a very early stage, and I was always a kind of artistic director from a very early point, more than being on stage myself. And I sat there and watched the rehearsal, and I maybe directed the rehearsal. And I, just by watching, I felt there was a lot of energy that it cost me. But I also kind of instinctively knew that by that energy that was flowing, I was leading the game. And I didn't understand what happened back then. Now I probably understand what happened, and that this was related to what I was saying before.
Yeah. Well, I definitely want to circle back a little later on and discuss some musical stuff. I'm really interested to hear some of your thoughts on things. But I'm wondering how, in the course of the last 6 or 7 years doing your podcast, how that has affected your practice or your approach to your ritual and hermeticism.
Yeah, but I think it has quite a bit. Of course, when you start that and say, well, how I'm going to do this, and well, the motivation was basically a European one, because as much as I admire that North America has taken over in a good way, I mean this in a good way, the practice, because so much is going on in North America, which is unfortunately not anymore going on the European side. I mean, of course, there are people practicing, but the development is much more on the American side, which is good. But I wanted to have a European voice with also reminding the background and where it comes from, and that was the initial idea. So my studies went into that direction, of course, because before I started the first episode, I wanted to have a clear view on what I was doing. And already that changed my approach to things, right? Because I found out things that I hadn't looked into before. And then when I started talking to people like, well, I just name her as an example because she's such a great lady, Dolores Ashcroft-Nowitzki, who was in one of my very early podcasts. And my God, when I spoke to that lady, that was amazing. You had the feeling she was 21 when you speak to her. She was over 90 at the time. And the energy and the knowledge and all that came over from her, that really was, and she was just an example. And I had several experiences, but she was a very particular one. And you say, well, I have to go deeper into that, what she said. And so it forced me to, not only before the show, because of course I like to be prepared about what I talk about, but also after the experience with those personalities I had the chance to meet, it brought me to deeper, maybe not knowledge, but to deeper involvement. And I looked much more into it, let alone be currents, which, for example, the octoadic current, which I hopefully will do a bigger show in the near future, is something that I discovered through my work with the podcast, and it has become a very important part of my personal practice because I feel somehow very much at home in that, right? So I would probably always have worked for myself in the esoteric currents, but I wouldn't have explored so many and learned so much about it without the podcast. So I got a lot of personal feedback from it.
Yes. Yeah. I mean, that's kind of why I asked. I've been sort of trained in the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn here in the States, and really my first foray into practical magic. I had studied Kabbalah and comparative religions, and Platonism has been with me my entire life. One of my first books at that age when you're able to read, start really absorbing things rather than just picture books and children's books, but coming up in the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn, it's somebody, one of my friends actually had compared it to being a very, I guess, classically trained musician, and then she also said, but there's people there playing jazz, and I thought that's pretty brilliant. But that's essentially what I discovered when I started podcasting, was that, wow, I have a very firm footing and foundation, but in something very specific, whereas there are so many avenues, especially right now, especially in the United States. Alchemy is exploding, Gnosticism is exploding, all these things that I thought I knew something about, and I really didn't. So it was also a humbling experience for me.
Of course, there is also always a risk into that you get in too many things at the time and cannot deepen your knowledge or your experience in one enough. Probably 40 years of theater and stage work have also shown that in this a certain approach, which I basically would call ceremonial magic in all its forms. And so the Golden Dawn is also something that's very close to my heart, even practically, right? My problem here personally was always that where I live in Austria, honestly, there is not much around, right? So I was more or less obliged either to join a group, one of the very few groups that would not really be my main interest, or to stay a solitary worker, and I chose more or less the latter. There are a few developments, and of course Freemasonry, even if it's not that esoteric a current as I would wish it to be, but especially not in Europe, but still it has been a framework where I also met other people who are interested in the same field as and I've even become, in Austrian, or at least Viennese Freemasonry, a kind of anchor point of esotericism. So, well, that comes with age probably, but also with dealing with things, of course.
Yes, and absolutely knowledge. I think
yeah, sure.
You have so much. You have not only your experience but other people's experience, kind of a nexus point for that. But that's sure. Also interesting because you say that obviously having so much experience in theater and a theater setting, but you've done mostly solo work. Have you found that in any group work that you may have done, even Masonry, that it's more potent, or is there something that are there pros and cons that you find in working as a solo practitioner versus the occasions you do get to participate in group ritual?
Mm-hmm. Well, there are pros and cons, certainly, at least to me, and I would think that part of it, of those pros and cons, is also depending on the individual personality of the person dealing with it. Of course, I think there are rules when I'm within an egregore, when I'm within a group who works in the same direction and it was a work together. And of course, I have done that. I keep doing that. Also, not in Masonry, but also beyond that. There is a force behind it that you cannot achieve when you are working on your own. That's for sure. But then maybe there are people who need that common feeling more than others, and it is an individual approach. And my approach also in life, that's not just in magic or in the occult or the esoteric worlds, is more that of a solo worker. That's just me. I mean, what I do now as a living is also something which, even if I stand in front of people and hold speeches, I mean, I work as a funeral speaker, right? It's still the preparation and the work and actually what you do. You are on your own and you do on your own. And I feel absolutely happy with that. And I know people who couldn't do that because they need the group to work with, right? So I think you have to transpose that from your day-to-day life also to your magical world and magical life. You cannot separate that.
Yeah, that's a good point. Kind of adjusting magical techniques uh, catered on based on not really like a cookie cutter approach or what I guess you think you're supposed to be doing, and rather feeling your way into
Yeah,
what works for you.
absolutely.
That makes perfect sense. It's pretty interesting, actually. Recently, I've become more interested in the Ogdoadic tradition as well. I feel myself
Okay.
being pulled to that kind of solo stuff. So I'm
Hmm.
experiencing a little bit of that now. For me, for a long time, it was group ritual. But well, one thing that I want to bring up at this point is one of my favorite features of your podcast in particular is the music that you play, the
Hmm.
musical pieces. I love them. I find that everything is very interesting and suiting the mood of there's nothing that really jumps out as being out of place. I think it takes some kind of obviously you have experience directing this stuff and working with this stuff, but I think that's a skill in choosing music. But um I'm assuming that music and magic for you are also very closely intertwined.
Absolutely. I would even say sound and magic. Music is an expression of sound, of course,
Mm.
and but it can be other sounds. There are two things which I would like to maybe expand on this. I
Sure.
mentioned shamanism before, right? And so at a very early stage, I experimented with shamanic traveling and with the drumming, yeah, of course, right? I hardly ever used drumming myself. I used tapes and headphones, and while I was lying there and doing that, and that worked very well. But after a rather brief period, a couple of months or so, and that's probably just a talent I have, but just to tell you what I feel about it, and I can still do that today, of course. I do not need the drums anymore. I can imagine the drums with the same effect. I hear the drums even if they're not there, because, well, sound is my element, so to speak, right? My main element in life. I'm much better on listening also than on smelling or on other senses, right? It's just because I train it and it's my talent. So I found that in the aftermath here again, I only found out later that this was a special thing I could do. And I find it rather interesting that I'm able to do that. Um, and the other thing, and it goes a bit in the same direction, is I I'm very interested and also sensitive to binaural sounds. I probably you all know the Monroe Institute's um, sound tapes, and I think this is fascinating. Alone the thought that the physical experience of having two frequencies which are just a little bit off in your right ear and in your left ear, but so it is your brain and just your brain and not a physical effect, scientific physical effect around you, not an acoustic effect, but a pure brain effect that creates this woo 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 in you, which then makes your brain work. I find that only the idea I find it fascinating, let alone the effect it has on me and I guess on many other people. And so I work a lot with that, right? In my personal life, it's not a classical esoteric approach. Actually, I am aware of that, but well, I never am as good in astral travel than with a previous session of binaural experience. So if it works for me, well, I take it.
That's very interesting. Actually, when I was in I didn't understand the science behind it. Obviously, I do understand sort of acoustic science. It's just a very base level. But
Mm.
I didn't understand the science behind the binaural sort of audio playing.
Hmm.
But when I was in recovery, I used to play that actually with headphones. I found that it helped me go to sleep.
Right.
It helped me really relax. But now that you're saying, it makes sense. Now that you're saying that it stimulated sort of that, inner eye, and the ability to astral travel. I would have the craziest dreams, and sometimes there was a higher instance for me of things like sleep paralysis at that time, and waking up and having visitors in the room and things like that.
That's probably yeah. And of course, it depends on the frequency that you create with that system. It depends how much those two frequencies that you have in both your ears are off for each from the other. So it's very simple when the frequency in your left ear or right ear, I mean, when the difference between the two frequencies is, say, 10 hertz, right? Then of course the brain gets its own resonance with 10 cycles a second, and depending on what number of cycles you go, you have either sleep effect, you have also a stimulating effect in awareness, or you have that astral approach. So it depends on the frequency. I would just like to warn our listeners of one thing, because, for example, on YouTube, there are so many of those tapes which call themselves binaural, and they are not. They are just creating this this wobbling sound, just to create it. Right. But it's not binaural. And there's a very easy way of testing if it's true or not. You just take out one of your headphones, right? From one side, you take it off your ear. And then the sound you hear in the other ear must stay steady. Otherwise, it's not binaural. Otherwise, It's just a recording of binaural, but it's not binaural. So
it's a tremolo
effect. It works
effect.
Only when you have both headphones on and you hear that frequency. When you take one off, if you don't anymore, then it's true binaural.
Yeah, that's good to know. Yeah, that's that's probably something I should have tested years ago. Just this random tremolo sound that's being pumped through my speakers. Well, I think that the interesting thing about that is your incorporation of new technologies, or really newer sort of uses of things like that, of sound, because just having the technology available, like headphones, to be able to use and plug the ears and play those simultaneously in stereo. So I mean, that's a huge part, I think, of exploring and broadening esoteric traditions and things like that. So I think that's pretty cool, even though it's not traditional. But that kind of brings me to my next point, which is over the course of the decades that you've spent in esoteric communities, and obviously, your point of reference for a long time was most likely the more European traditions over there and what was going on. But becoming a podcast host and stepping out onto more of a public stage and interacting with, Americans, Canadians, etc. What have you found? What are some of the major changes that you've noticed in the communities in the last 6 or 7 years?
Well, first of all, I have to say that 85% I can say of my audience is North American, right? On my podcast. So that's quite interesting, right?
I didn't know that.
Yeah. So that's really interesting. But well, I think the community has become extremely more diverse in all senses, right? It's the traditions have widened. There is much more going on different levels. I mean, basically 6 or 7 years back, at least in my perception, you had Golden Dawn, you had Selima, you had some solo practitioners, and then you have the left-hand path, and that was it, right? And now you have all those. At least they have become vocal. They have come out of their hiding, so to speak. They are much more on out there and speaking about their practices. All kinds of well, the occultic tradition is one of those that you mentioned and I mentioned, so certainly one of those. And there are others of that kind. And maybe I only see them better also because, of course, I deal more with them. And it's always been my interest on the podcast to show as many currents as possible and talk about them, even if maybe they are not it's not something I would practice or would like to do, but they are there and you want to talk about them and to inform people about them and get to know yourself more about it. And I think that has become much wider than it used to be, even 5 or 6 years ago. I don't think I imagined that because I work with it more, but I think it's really a reality. And of course, a good indicator is also esoteric publishing, which has extremely developed. Of course, I work a lot, as probably you do too, with authors and with publishing houses, and to see what is going on there. And mainly, there has been a big shift towards also individual and small publishing houses who do very high level work. And I don't think that existed to that extent 6 or 7 years ago. So think about Scarlet Imprint, for example, or, oh my God, I've got to name a few and the others are all going to be jealous. Or Anathema Publishing, for example, or you take, the guy Theon Publishing. Okay, here it is. But just to name a few, right? I mean, there are others and they are really doing great stuff. And that has not existed a few years ago, that high quality book. And not cheap, right? Not cheap, of course, because it has its cost to produce it, and it's like an object, right?
Yeah,
I find that fascinating, and so digital publishing, of course, has also become more important, and I'm a bit old-fashioned on that. I like to have the book in hand. I kind of need to have the book in hand to really enjoy it, but maybe that's just me.
Right. Well, I think to your point there, that is one of the advantages for writers and people who are a little bit more old-fashioned, because I am too. I simply cannot read. I can't finish anything that's on a screen that's more than, essay size. And sometimes you'll get people who will send you PDF books to read and to comment on. It's extremely difficult for me to finish anything. I need the book. And I think that our communities are some of the few communities left where that tends to be the case. And so there's high value on, beautifully designed, inlaid books, nice binding, good pages, hardcovers. You see a lot more of that now. And also, I guess that dovetails, right? You've seen it, obviously, by the guests that you've had on. It's dovetailing with this increase in erudition, scholarly, academic sort of a lot of interest in this stuff now.
By the way, there is something maybe you mentioned the academic world, and I was lucky enough to have really a few high academicians on my podcast, and I think there has been a shift there when maybe a few years ago, if you were an academic and working in the field of esotericism, you were not allowed to also practice any of that, right? Because otherwise you wouldn't have been neutral anymore or so, right? And this has now changed, and I find that very positive. Richard Kaczynski, when he was on my podcast, we were talking about this, and he once said, well, it sounds to me, and I find that very funny and true, like if you were a Catholic believer and not allowed to study theology. Why should you not study in an academic way esotericism, occultism, by also practicing one of the fields at the same time? And I must say, Wouter Hanegraaff, I asked him that question, and I thought he would be rather closed on that matter, and to my surprise said no, he wasn't. He said he couldn't do it. He would not himself be able to practice and to study it, but he completely accepts that people can and do. So I think, again, there we are on a different level. And I think that's a development that has changed over the last 5-6 years. It's now possible, at least, if you want, to practice and to be an academic in the field at the same time.
Yeah, I think that's wonderful as well. I think we were talking about responsibility earlier, and again, you had said, you had mentioned a preface that you hope people don't think that you find yourself too important, and so I will reiterate that, right? But I'm American, so people expect that from me. But
maybe that's right.
But that's one of the things that drew me into feeling like I should contribute my voice, is that it seemed that on the internet, especially, it was kind of overrun with this academic, very, very skeptical approach to this stuff. At least those were the voices that were the loudest. They were the people that were getting the most traction. So I find it, because I try to be very erudite, and I do have an education, college. It's not in history or esotericism, but I work with Yale seminarians and Oxford educated people to make sure that I'm staying frankly, that I don't kind of veer off into speculation, because the two are very, very they can work harmoniously if you give both of them their sort of their own realms of authority. But to me, it feels like, how can you really speak on magic if you don't, because essentially a lot of it has to do with subjective experience. That's how, your interpretation of the magical processes as they manifest in your environment, in yourself. There's no way to talk about that academically.
Absolutely. So. Well, I would try to put that in a more, maybe also even in a more hermetic way of looking at it. The purely academic world has a tendency, even in humanities, which is strange, to become more and more quantifying, more and more drawing the matter into the matter, right? Drawing the things they talk about into the material world only, and leave the spirit part. And we are, of course, dualistic beings, right? You cannot just talk about something, especially if it's magic or things related to the holistic approach of life. You cannot draw them to the ground and nail them down with quantity. And I find that very dangerous, because then you leave out the very important part. And what you describe here, I think that's partly due to that tendency that we have in the world in general at the moment. And that's a constant idea I try to share, that we are beings who also have, I'm not saying, I don't like the word spiritual in that context, because it is connotated in the wrong sense. I mean, we are part matter and we are part spirit, call it spirit or soul, whatever you want to call it, but we are not only matter. On the contrary, we couldn't be if we were only matter. But if we leave that aside, if we only are concerned with matter, but then we have a problem. And of course, that manifests much more clearly in the magical and esoteric world, because, without spirit, what should we do? Why are we here, right?
Right, exactly. It's interesting to me also. You've been a Freemason for you said, I think, 32 years or so. Mm-hmm. So I'm very new to Freemasonry. I avoided it at first because it didn't have the male-female compatibility. Now I understand it, that it can actually make you a more well-balanced man. But I'm interested as to what your thoughts are on Well, over here in the States, I can't speak for what's going on over there. We're experiencing a push towards more youth membership lately, and then, but also with that, traditional observance. It's getting very traditional in Masonry in some quarters. Is that something that's also happening in Europe, in Austria?
No, I think it's very, I mean, Masonry has always been very different in different parts of the world, and also its development by consequence. For example, here in Austria, by history, we have been in hiding for most of the time, right? During the Austro-Hungarian Empire, it was not possible. So only for a few years during Mozart's time, as some people might know, and then it was forbidden again until 1918. And then, of course, during the Nazi years, it was forbidden again. And so we are much more discreet society here in Austria than in England, of course, and let alone in the United States. And that has its consequences in the behavior, right? Also in what you work at. But I see, I mean, I've always been interested in the international part of Masonry, and I see what you mean. And I see that as a very positive development, what you're mentioning here, that it gets younger and that it becomes, I wouldn't even call it traditionalist. I would say the approach has become a bit more esoteric again, going away from what we call fork and knife Masonry, right? Where the most important thing is that you have a nice dinner after your meetings, and well, also do some charity, good, but that's about it. And I think young people, when they join Masonry, if they join Masonry, they want something else from it, and that's a good sign. And yes, I would say a little bit we have that here also, to a certain extent, maybe not to the same extent than in the US, because we stand at a different place, but there are similarities, yes.
Yeah, that's interesting. You know, it's not something that I had thought about. The fact that, you know, over in your region, it was vehemently suppressed, and so that obviously would characterize because you know, with the advent of Instagram and things like this now, you've got people taking pictures and you know, in lodges and things. It's like kind of I've you know I've been in a couple, but I try. That is one thing that seems to me that it can get a little out of hand. How public everyone is very comfortable with being. Don't get me wrong. I've taken pictures in lodges before, but there's something about you know, never during ritual.
Yeah, but we are an esoteric podcast here, and I think people will understand when I say this is not only to do with I am a secret society, or I don't want to be seen because we want to do things here that nobody should know about. I think being silent, being hidden, not being in the outer world has an occult meaning, a deep occult meaning, and Masonry must not forget that. Of course, it's linked to all kinds of Hermetic thought and to Rosicrucian thought and all of that, but maybe one should just reread the Rosicrucian Manifesto from time to time to understand why, and because Masonry, not being Rosicrucian necessarily, but it is very much the same way of thinking. Heal people, don't take money for it, and don't speak about it, right? For example, right? And being silent. Why in France, for example, for a long time, probably no more any longer, the apprentice was not allowed to speak in lodge, and that's not because he was not capable and he was too stupid to do it. No, because you have to learn to listen, and when you are too noisy yourself, you don't hear, right? When you are too much outgoing, then you don't look at yourself, and so I think that's the reason for being hidden and for not taking Instagram photos in lodge and stuff, because we are in a different world while we are in lodge.
Yeah, that's an excellent point. I'm very glad that you very eloquently explained that. I think a lot of my listeners will resonate with that, or have something to chew on there. So currently, I know that you've spoken in the past about you have a very serious practice. You are definitely somebody who does ritual and these kind of things. And I from what I understand, you're more of a hermeticist in that way. Is there anything in esotericism at the current moment that's really grabbing your attention, that you're interested in, or is there some area that a person that specializes in that you may have recently spoken with or interviewed for season 10? What's exciting to you right now?
Well, if I might mention two people who I had, exactly in that run before I shut down for a time, in that run when I said and both of them will be back in October, I believe, or at the latest in November, because in two very different approaches, they inspire me and also open new paths. I'm always fascinated by people who are able to combine tradition with a new approach. And one of them really, I thought, does an excellent job in the arts world is Marlene Seven-Bremner, who I think you also had on the show lately.
Yeah, she's fantastic.
She is fantastic. And when I saw her first book, which appeared about a year and a half ago, and the way she explains Hermeticism and what is the difference between Hermetism and Hermeticism, in 3 pages, you suddenly get it. What other people write 3 books, and then you think, okay, well, maybe, but not. This is an extraordinary talent to be able to do that. And at the same time, she's very creative and combines arts. And of course, that's a special approach for me, because I'm in the arts world, in the music world, and the arts world. And of course, that triggers me more maybe than others, but I find her very interesting. And the other person, and there we talk about the subject that might be more common, is the subject I mean is AI, artificial intelligence, which of course is a big thing to be discussed. And I'm very reluctant on many things that are happening in the world with that. And I also see a certain danger, not only to humanity in general, but to the esoteric side in particular. And there is a guy, Robert Gordon, you might have heard him, who is part of the Societas Rosicruciana in Anglia, and who has written books on Rosicrucianism, a youngish guy. But he specializes, he also wrote some novel about the matter, in seeing how those old traditions and AI, what will be the outcome? Where does that go together? How can it go together? Can it go together? And we are going to do a show on that matter in a few weeks. And I find that a real interesting matter. Normally, if I wouldn't meet a person like him, I would say, well, I don't touch this subject because AI is dangerous, but he is able to tell you that there are aspects of it that maybe also can help develop even esotericism. So I can't say much more for the moment. We haven't recorded the show yet, but we're preparing for it. And that's an aspect I really find fascinating. I always like to get myself informed on things that I, in the first place, don't like, and find out there's something more to it that I could like. So that's and that's certainly, AI is certainly a matter where that's necessary, at least for me.
Yeah, I mean, that's an excellent trait to have. I tend to keep my hands off anything. I mean, pretty new that technologically. I think I was 28 years old when I had a smartphone. I was like, it was a long, and it was my generation, that started buying them up. But that is very interesting. I had a conversation with Aaron Leach about that. He's very much interested in this using AI in occult methods. I guess it's like anything else, maybe, we can use it for good. We can use it for bad. I think that's
Yeah,
just
sure.
us. That's just people. So I'll be looking out for that, because that sounds like a really interesting.
I have no idea yet where it's going, but we are doing it, and so the outcome is still to be seen.
Great, awesome. So, do you have anything else in the works other than finishing out season 10? I know sometimes you put together a series of lectures and things like that.
Right. I have been planning that, and I think I will be doing it again starting in January or February, to do what I call Thoth-Hermes Academy, which I did once and had really a nice outcome, a nice success. We had 5 people who held the lecture of 45-ish minutes, and then a live discussion for those who participated. And that was really nice. What I really am surprised, and that's why I also would like to redo that academy, and that came out very clearly in this little academy. We had maybe 50, 60 people each time listening, which is quite nice, and discussing, which is even nicer. But I might say that even on the whole lot of our listeners, and I think you have a bit the same experience, I have hardly any stupid remarks or trolls or anything, and I really must pay big credit to my audience. They are a great audience. They seem to be really interested. They stay. I can also see, and I'm sure you do the same on my podcast provider, the ones the guys who kind of the machinery that posts it on the different services, and they survey how long people stay on each episode, and they stay 70 to 80%, which is extremely high, right? Yes. So I find that really great, and that's a good sign for the audience, and I'm really very happy that I have that kind of audience, and who also make. They don't react a lot, but when they react, it's clever and intelligent.
Well, you've been very good to us. I mean, that's why.
Thank you.
It's an excellent podcast, really, honestly, and it's becoming more and more of a necessity, I think, as you may have intuited, to have reliable, grounded, diverse conversations with mature practitioners, and then you get a mature, diverse, reliable audience. I think that's
hopefully, yes. Well, that's a comfort sometimes in this stupid world out there.
Yeah. So I have a canned question that everybody gets at the end of each episode.
Okay.
For anyone listening to this podcast today, that we talked about sound, and we talked about Masonry, we talked about Hermeticism. For anybody that's listened to this episode and wants to dive in a little deeper about some of these subjects, could you recommend between 1 and 3 books, or if there's some other media that you're familiar with, whether it's a documentary or lecture series, you can use that too.
Okay. That's a big question.
Yeah.
Well, funny enough, first thing that comes to mind is really the book I just mentioned a few minutes ago. That first of Marlene's books on Hermeticism and creativity. I think this is really especially for people who are into Hermeticism, but maybe not really deep into it yet, but who want to get more than the baseline, but build on the baseline. I think that first of her books is really, Marlene Seven-Bremner's book is really one of the 3 that I would name here. I still find, you're gonna laugh maybe, because of course we all know that it's old and it's partly gone and not more up to date, but I think Manly P. Hall's main work is still a kind of Bible that you should have at home and read, because I just admire what that gentleman has done, and what he has collected. with an openness and a broad approach to esotericism from all over the world, but still based in the Western tradition. I think that's a really, really very, very good thing to have on your desk. Well, what could be number 3? I would be looking for something that bridges the approach of science and esotericism as a basic work, because I think it's necessary to understand that, and I'm not a Crowleyan at all, but there he was really right. It's the science and art of creating something, right? And I think to understand that link between science and art, or science and esotericism, is very important. First thing that comes to mind, but there are others I just maybe don't think of that. Dean Radin has written good works on that.
Yes.
And he certainly is somebody you should know and have read. Get yourself a book which talks about science and its link, the scientific approach to esotericism. Let's put it that way. It would be a book on the scientific approach to Dean Radin is a good choice. There are others around, but he's the first who comes to mind.
Yeah, I think all of those are excellent suggestions. I mean, yeah, I think Marlena's or Seven's book is Hermetic Philosophy and Creative Alchemy. That's the title for it. Yeah,
exactly.
And one book that I actually kind of randomly stumbled across that is unexpectedly did exactly what you're talking about was The Holographic Universe by Michael Talbot. So a lot of people, this was in the 80s he wrote this book, or
absolutely
early 90s.
Yeah.
But I think late 80s, and it really informs ideas like the astral that we're constantly talking about, with Bohm's implicate order in that book. It's, I'm not going to go too deep in, but it does exactly what you're saying, kind of unexpectedly so. And it fleshes out this idea even of, the Hermetic conception of the microcosm and the macrocosm. It's all perfectly summed in that book. And so a lot of people, when they'll come to me and ask me for a book recommendation, that's one of the first ones I tell them. And they kind of look at me with their eyes crossed, like, what?
Yeah. Well, I also think sometimes, I mean, that's not now one of my 3 main recommendations, get me right. But what you say when you speak about older books, I mentioned Mendy Hall, of course, but one of my first readings was Castaneda. Right. And Castaneda, and like many of my generation, we started with that. And of course, then later on, everyone said, well, Castaneda, we don't even know if that's not all an invention. Well, who cares? It was a good invention because it brought so many people like me into that esoteric world. Like it just reminds me that when people, it was in the 1980s, there was that big thing. Did William Shakespeare really write his plays, or was it somebody else? But who cares? The plays are there. If that guy was called Shakespeare or Macmillan, who cares, right? Hamlet exists, right? And it's the same with Castaneda. He brought many of us, to esotericism through this work. And we later on understood maybe it wasn't all true that he was saying, but still he opened our minds. And I think we should not be too arrogant to things like that. See what they have been able to do.
Well said. Rudolf Berger, thank you so much for joining me today. Thank you for giving me a little slice of your time. I'm humbled and honored to have spoken with you, truly. No. And I'm looking forward to the rest of season 10 and the Thoth-Hermes Academy and everything else that you've got on the docket. Thank you so much for everything that you do.
Thank you. It was great to be with you. Thank you.